Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, this is Lily Gorin with the New Books Network, the New Books in Political Science podcast. Today I'm joined by E.J. Fagan, who's the author of The Thinkers, The Rise of Partisan Think Tanks and the Polarization of American Politics. This was published just recently in June 2024 by Oxford University Press. And it takes us into think tanks, which are all in the news at the moment, given Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation. But I'm going to let EJ talk to us a little bit about that. I'd like to welcome EJ Fagan to the podcast and ask him to tell us a little bit about himself and how he came to this project. Hi, EJ.
Hi, Lily. Thank you for having me on. I'm a assistant professor at UIC, University of Illinois, Chicago. I came to this project because I used to work at a think tank. I'm not one of these. I worked at a much smaller think tank. It was a small place called Global Financial Integrity. We did anti-money laundering policy. And then I went to grad school, and I was reading all these theories of power, of influence, of who should, what interest groups and what types of people should be powerful in politics. And none of them included think tanks, right? None of the think tanks didn't fit into any of those paradigms. And so I said, and my dissertation advisor, Brian Jones, kind of challenged me very early. He said, well, first thing you got to do is learn how to measure it. And I kind of started going down that path, and eventually landed on this project, which I really really didn't expect to end up where I did.
And you do, in fact, figure out, in a way, how to measure the influence of think tanks on policy. And you also, and I think this was maybe a little bit of a byproduct, but the first half of the book also talk about how think tanks contribute to the current polarized political dynamic in the United States. So I would like to ask you first, tell us what a think tank is, particularly in the American context, because it's different than in a lot of European democracies and other democracies.
Sure. So in the American context, a think tank overall, I would say, it's an organization that's trying to influence public policy, and its primary means of doing so is through information. So they're not doing other interest group stuff, right? They're not doing a ton of electioneering. They're not intervening in elections. They're not doing kind of traditional forms of pressure group work and activism. They don't represent a constituency necessarily. Now, there are think tank-like activities that a lot of groups engage in, and a lot of places that call themselves think tanks that do a lot of that other stuff. But for conceptually, I think about them as primarily all they are doing is they're being experts, and they're doing expert stuff. That might mean producing reports. That might mean privately corresponding with policymakers. That's the type of thing that think tanks are best at. That's also distinct from what we do as academics. So as academics, we are producing information, and maybe some of us would like that information to be used in policymaking decisions, but it's not our primary focus. We are primarily in the intellectual world rather than the policy world, which makes think tanks a very important mediating layer between the kind of raw material that scientists and academics produce, and other places like some government agencies, and the policymaking world. In the United States, there's a particular type of think tank which differs from other countries, and that is a think tank that is a party think tank, or in the United States, I call them partisan think tanks. And the distinction is that many think tanks they're private organizations. Some look very much like universities. They call themselves universities without students, and they might have some sort of agenda, some sort of policy they want to influence, but they're not insiders. They're not a part of the party's operations. Now, in the United States, it is not legal for think tanks to be part of the party operations, or at least that's not really the way that it works, because of campaign finance law. And so what happens in other countries is that you have a formal party organizations that are controlled by the political parties, and they produce expert information as think tanks. Those are party think tanks. Since you can't do that in the United States, you have private organizations that have their own private policy goals like any other interest group, but they're doing that partisan role. They're insiders in the party, and that's who I wanted to study. I didn't study the four largest think tanks in the United States. Maybe I didn't even study the four most influential think tanks in the United States, but I studied the four most partisan think tanks, the ones that are on the inside, that are forming this kind of close policy advisory role for the Democratic and Republican parties. They are officially nonpartisan because for tax reasons they have to be officially nonpartisan, but they are partisans in all but official capacity. And that gives them a lot of really interesting functions. And so in the book, I describe those functions. We can talk more about those, and that's why I think makes them the most interesting think tanks, if not the most influential think tanks, because they are in many ways the most political. Whereas most think tanks, they're interesting to me, but they're doing what I would call very kind of day-to-day banal expert work that experts all over the system do, whereas these think tanks are doing partisan work in a much more different way.
So when you talk about the partisan work, and this is a lot of what you're talking about in the book, these are experts who work at AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, or the Center for American Progress, or Heritage, as we've been hearing a lot about them. And so they may have PhDs, they may have studied for a long time in a particular area. But what you're talking about in terms of their political influence is the way that they generate information, expertise, knowledge that is then something that the parties or campaigns or people running for office pick up. Is that correct?
I think so. I also think that once they're in office, they need close policy advisors. They need people who are not just experts, but understand their needs, understand their, why they take their positions, that they can trust, that are friends. And no matter how credible an expert, somebody at a neutral organization can't play that role. Which is why in every system in the world you have some version of this role, and it's often publicly financed and controlled by the political parties. But now in the United States, that's just not the case. That's not what we have. We have privately financed, controlled privately, occupying this role. What are they doing? They're often helping them form policy positions, helping them make those decisions. I tell lots of stories in the book of times when there was a core policy decision. For example, how do we structure the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the stimulus bill after the 2008 financial crisis at the very beginning of the Obama first term? How do we structure that? And they tapped to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and Center for American Progress, two of the two largest Democratic think tanks, to help them write different parts of that bill. And they were essentially an extension of the Obama transition team during that period. That bill was written during the transition. It was a unique period where they were legislating in Congress before Democrats occupied the White House. And so to write pieces of that bill, they didn't have what you would normally have in the White House to help you write that bill. And I have a wonderful story from Bob Greenstein, who's the president of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in the book, where he says, for 2 weeks, we were the White House because they were busy. They didn't have people on staff ready to write out the finer details of that bill. But Barack Obama wanted that bill ready basically the minute he took office. And so the Obama White House basically told members, people in Congress, you want help on the details, call the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. That's power. That's influence. That is important. And you can use that for good, right? You can try to help elected leaders, to make their democratic decisions. But also, these are interest groups, right? They want stuff out of government. And so, you can take advantage of that position. I think we've seen, for example, the Heritage Foundation during this recent campaign essentially try to take advantage of their closeness to the Republican Party and to the Donald Trump wing of that party. And that's hurt the Republican Party. It's clearly hurt the Republican Party because they're trying to disown the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025 in a way that I don't think is particularly credible. But it tells you that there's this conflict between what the groups want and what the parties want. Candidates want to win, right? They want to produce policy that's popular, that helps them accomplish those goals. Whereas groups, they don't really care whether or not they win as long as they get the policy. And so if it costs the members of Congress, some seats in the next election, if it makes it harder to win a presidential election, that only really matters to the extent that it limits your ability to get policy through.
And so when you talk about the fact that you studied the four most political think tanks, now that we've had a definition of think tanks and to some degree a little bit of how they operate, you focus in on two Democratic-leaning, left-leaning think tanks and two Republican or right-leaning think tanks. And so, how did you, in fact, measure their political influence as opposed to other think tanks? And there are many that you don't really pay as much attention to in the book.
Yeah, I think this is the core problem with a lot of the literature on think tanks. It's one reason why political scientists haven't studied a lot of think tanks. Much of the work I draw on is from sociology and history. It's really hard because think tanks are present, and they also love to talk about how influential they are. And so, anybody familiar with the Heritage Foundation during this campaign will tell you that they are willing to take credit for things, and so you can't take them at their word. And you can't just say that they're present, so therefore they are influential. And so this took me a long time to figure out. I tested some ideas. I thought about using like plagiarism detection software, and that just didn't really work. It's not they're working at a conceptual level, not on a literal text for text level. Did some agenda setting stuff, and I show in the book that they don't really set agendas. They might respond to agendas, but that's about it. And I ended up kind of asking, like, what is their goal? Well, their goal, if you're a Democrat or if you're a progressive or conservative think tank, is to make Democrats or Republicans more progressive or conservative. And that's polarization when it works. And so I said, well, I can measure polarization several different ways, and I can measure think tank influence. And I should hypothesize that where think tanks are more present, not necessarily more influential, when they're more present, that we should see more polarization. And that's how I measured their influence. In addition to anecdotal stuff, qualitative work, I did quite a few interviews. There's quite a few stories in there. But what I'm most proud of is that I was able to measure this quantitatively. I was able to show evidence that I think is persuasive to a skeptic, that there's a very, very strong connection. It's correlational. It's over time, but it's correlational between the increased importance of think tanks and polarization, both over time, so across Congress overall. And then I think the thing that I think is most innovative about this is that I use the Policy Agendas Project or Comparative Agendas Project to measure individual issues. And I developed a way to measure polarization across each of those issues. It's real simple. It's a party disagreement score across each issue. And I was able to show really strong correlations, both in that over time. I mean, one of the closest correlations I've ever seen. In fact, it's almost too close, and we can talk about that. But also across issue areas. So issue areas that have more think tanks, that think tanks do all sorts of stuff, and I can measure the stuff that they do. As they do more of that stuff in that area, they get to be, the polarization is higher in that area. Can't really measure whether, the strictly causally identified, because these things are very endogenous. But I think it's persuasive. I instead of taking a tightly identified approach, I took kind of a quantity approach. I said, well, this test is significant. This test is significant. Used a lot of different types of unrelated data, and it's all pointing in the same direction, which is where the think tanks are is more polarization.
And that was what I found sort of surprising when you sort of say it early on in the book, was that think tanks have contributed significantly to the polarization in American politics if we sort of look at this from about the 1970s forward. And that it is about the way that they have been sort of developing issue and policy, and then essentially selling it to the candidates in the parties. And that tracks along how we have become much, much more polarized over the years.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it is like they didn't invent conservatism, right? Hans Noel and others have shown that's invented much earlier, in the 1940s, 50s, and places like the National Review.
Right.
And, Republicans were identifying as conservative long before that. But if you look at what actually happened, the actual policy they were working on in the United States Congress, you don't begin to see that polarized until the late 1970s, right? Nixon says he's a conservative and then establishes the EPA. And in fact, this created a real feeling of betrayal that conservatives still feel to this day. It's still one of the defining features of conservative politics is that Republicans will always betray them. There are rhinos everywhere. That's because of there was no way to translate those kind of conservative ideas and kind of intellectual feelings, normative beliefs about politics into actual policy prescriptions. So you could say I'm a conservative, but then when it comes time to solve problems, well, you're just going to talk to experts who are neutral. And so they're going to give you the same ideas that they're going to give Democrats. And the conservatives see this. And those ideas are usually, here's a government program that will solve that problem that your voters are yelling at you to solve. Well, usually that's going to be an expansion of government. And that was the case in the Nixon and Ford administrations and the Eisenhower administrations, Republicans in Congress. Because that's just the realities of policymaking. The policymaking is set by the agenda, and the agenda is mostly external. Parties are mostly agenda takers, not agenda makers. And there's a problem that has to be solved, right? For the EPA, it was like Ohio's river's on fire. Do something about it. And what are you going to do? Well, there's not only so many real free market solutions to problems. There are many. So, for example, you look at the deregulation push in the late 1970s. The Heritage Foundation wasn't particularly involved in that. It was established in 1973. So it was around, wasn't particularly involved, but that was a case where there was free market solutions, and Democrats and Republicans agreed on those solutions, and they did it. And they deregulated the communications industry, the trucking industry, et cetera. But most problems, the answer is mostly do more government if you want to solve the problem. And something about being conservative and libertarian is actually one of the features is you have to say, no, we don't want to solve this problem. And that's fine intellectually, and conservatives do deeply believe that often. But it doesn't work in a democracy, because in a democracy, usually citizens want you to solve problems. They want the problem to go away. And so you got to do it. And Republicans for years responded that way. They responded with government programs to solve problems that were on the agenda. And the think tanks, they found a way to short circuit that. That was the goal, was to get in between Republicans first. Eventually, Democrats kind of start doing this as well. But first, this is a Republican project. Get between Republican lawmakers, Republican policymakers, and neutral experts, and say, no, you're not going to listen to those neutral experts. You're going to listen to our experts. And our experts are going to say, you can actually solve this problem with less government, with conservative public policy. I think I've shown some pretty persuasive evidence that was not correct, that many of their ideas did not kind of hold up to reality, and that they tended to give very rosy estimates for things like the cost of a tax cut, the effect of a climate change bill on something like economic growth. But Republicans bought it. Right, they were pushing on an open door. Republicans wanted to believe this stuff. Right, they're conservatives, they're friends, they're true believers. Right, they wanted to believe that they could have their cake and eat it too. And eventually, Democrats respond as well. So Heritage shows up in 1973. The American Enterprise Institute had already existed since the 1920s, but significantly changes itself shortly after Heritage shows up to kind of fit this model, though still remained, and still I think remains, more of an academic organization than the Heritage Foundation. A bunch of other smaller think tanks that I don't talk a lot about in the book also show up around this time. And they're really powerful. During the Reagan administration, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that the Heritage Foundation is the most powerful interest group in the United States. They formed an early alliance with Ronald Reagan, and they had a lot of access and influence. And then, during when Newt Gingrich becomes a close ally of the Heritage Foundation, I quote from a Heritage book in 1988, where he basically introduces half of the contract with America in the foreword of the book. That was a Heritage Foundation book. They become just very powerful and very influential. And it takes Democrats a long time to respond. They eventually do. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities is created in the 1980s, but it doesn't get big until the 2000s. And in 2003, the big event is we have an equal and opposite think tank to the Heritage Foundation called the Center for American Progress that's founded. Very much founded in Heritage's image. I actually talked to somebody at the Heritage Foundation who said that they were so proud of their think tank that they actually consulted informally with the Center for American Progress to structure it. They're like, "Hey, I'll tell you how to create a think tank." And I some of those people told me they structured how we wish we would have structured it in 1973 because we've learned all of our lessons. So the Center for American Progress is founded, and they play a really big role in the Obama administration, especially the early part of the Obama administration on the Affordable Care Act, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, doing very similar things, providing really rosy estimates. I didn't want to make this book just about Heritage, and it's really clear that Democrats kind of got sold a bill of goods a little bit with some of, especially the success of the climate policy and the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act on jobs, right? I mean, the problem on the agenda was there's a recession. We need to do something to solve the recession. John Podesta, the president of the Center for American Progress, chair of the Obama transition, former Bill Clinton chief of staff, said, well, if you were to spend money, you might as well spend money on wind and solar and a bunch of other things. And that was actually really successful at accomplishing progressive goals. We might be better on climate change now than we would have been if not for that bill. Tesla exists because of that bill. The American wind and solar industry was jump-started by that bill. But it didn't have much a short-term effect on jobs. And Democrats got hammered in the 2010 election. And I think that's a pattern that we see repeated out when you cede your expertise to someone with an agenda.
And so, again, you have Center for American Progress, you have Heritage, you have the American Enterprise Institute, and you have the Center
on Budget and Policy Priorities.
Budget and Policy Priorities. Thank you. And a lot of times people think about think tanks. They also think about places like the Brookings Institution,
Yep.
which is huge, or the Hoover Institution, which is out on the West Coast at Stanford University. And then there are some smaller ones in the middle of the country as well. And so these four, as you note, are the ones who are the most political. So how do you distinguish the other ones, just as a little bit of a sidebar, from these particular four?
It's a great question. And I think actually if I were doing this again today, I think you'd make an argument that the American Enterprise Institute would not be one of them. I think it's a pretty clear top four. I've had other think tanks I've discussed putting in there. So, for example, some studies of left of center think tanks include the Brookings Institution. Brookings is left of center the way that my university is, right? The University of Illinois Chicago, pretty sure we got more Democrats working here than Republicans. But we're not a part of the Democratic Party. We have Republicans working here doing work that is valuable to Republicans. We have nonpartisans working here or just scientists. They're just doing science stuff. But on net, it's a left-leaning institution like most universities are. Brookings Institution is like that. Some of their most prominent scholars are actually former Heritage staffers, including Stuart Butler, who is a very famous Heritage staffer, is now at the Brookings Institution. They also have very prominent former Democratic staffers like Bob Greenstein of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, who's now at the Brookings Institution. That's the kind of place it is. It's not a party apparatus. They're not doing party stuff like helping write policy platforms. So Neera Tanden, the president of the Center for American Progress, helped write the Hillary Clinton policy platform because she was a former longtime Hillary Clinton staffer, an Obama administration staffer. The Heritage Foundation writes something like Project 2025, where 19 of the 25 people who are recording videos for them, as we found out this week, are former high-level Trump administration staffers. That's a different type of activity. I think these other think tanks are fascinating. The next project is all going to be about those other think tanks, or the think tank ecosystem. There are hundreds of think tanks. They are very powerful and very important, and have lots of politics there. But the partisan politics is very rare. Like most interest groups, most think tanks want to work with both sides because policymaking is bipartisan. For the most part. And so you want to, if you care about an issue, if you want to provide information on that issue, you got to work with Republicans and Democrats. Partisanship can only take you so far. There are other think tanks that represent small factions of parties. So the Republican Party think tank ecosystem has been fascinating in the Trump world. Again, the American Enterprise Institute, very much on the outside. And then there's been a flourishing of smaller think tanks, which have been kind of vying for that spot with Donald Trump. If Donald Trump wins the election, they'll be very important. If he loses the election, I don't know, right? Like, I don't know what happens to not only those small think tanks, but the Heritage Foundation if Donald Trump wins. I mean, I think it'd be really fascinating. On the left, you have a big flourishing of small think tanks. And I interviewed a lot of people at those think tanks. And it's clear that although, they are powerful people, they're influential people in Washington, D.C., they're not in the same category. They're not, for example, another Bob Greenstein story. There was a budget deal that Nancy Pelosi negotiated, and progressives, it was about 2 or 3 years ago, were skeptical. They said, I think that we're giving away too much. They were skeptical of some of the very specific provisions. And they held a House Democratic caucus call, and they just called up Bob Greenstein and said, can you please come on the call and explain this? Right? That's a kind of street cred that in most interest groups don't have, right? Even very important interest groups in the Democratic Party, they're not joining House Democratic caucus calls on the regular. That's very common. And so I don't think there's really an argument, at least during the period that I'm covering, that there really should be any other think tanks in there. I think there's just a clear drop off. But you could say maybe I should have looked at 10, 12, and then there's a clear drop off after that. And that's the next project, right? I'm fascinated by these organizations and I'm going to keep studying them.
And so I wanted to ask you also about the way that you structured the book, because you divide it in half. And we've talked a little bit about, how you sort of were looking at the first half, which is also tracing the history of these think tanks and when they came to be and how they started to influence. And then you have the second half of the book, which is a little bit different in terms of the policy agenda. And so when you look at the origins of these think tanks, one of the questions that many of us have is also who's underwriting them? Where is the money coming from? Because as you note, in comparison to European or other democracies, they're getting state funding. Most of these think tanks are not necessarily getting state funding, or if they are, they're not getting very much at all.
Yeah, and the ones that get state funding are think tanks are like the Rand Corporation. They're very nonpartisan, and they're essentially an extension of the federal government's policy analysis capacity. Let me answer the second question first. They are getting funding from very similar networks that political parties raise money from. There is a couple of exceptions. One is their 501c3 nonprofit organization. Some have 501c4 companions. A nonprofit organization can take unlimited donations, and those donations are tax deductible. They cannot be used in lobbying or electioneering activities. A C4 is not tax deductible, and that's traditional political work like lobbying and electioneering. And usually what happens is you have the same people working at both, and a portion of their salary is paid by the C4 to cover their lobbying activity. They're getting very large donations, but they're not, for most of these, the think tanks that I'm talking about here, that these four, they're not reliant on one patron. And they're not relying on, for example, an industrial patron. They're basically raising money from on the progressive side, a lot of foundations who are interested in progressive work. So places like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and just a lot of really ideological rich people. Their typical donation is smaller than, for example, like a super PAC or something like that. That is the Heritage Foundation likes to talk about how they have the ability to refuse donors. So they can say they'll get, these are still large donations, but $1 million from this family, $1 million from that family, $1 million from another, instead of $30 million from one place. Because once one donor controls that much of your budget, then they have a lot of power over you. The center-left think tank New America found this out recently when Eric Schmidt, who was the CEO of Google in 2017, gave it $25 million and then said, please don't do any antitrust work anymore. They had to kick out their antitrust program because they didn't really have a choice. That was their patron. That was the reason why they were able to continue to fund themselves. That worked out pretty well since the senior fellow there was Lena Khan, who's currently chair of the FTC. That's the next project. So I don't want to talk too much about that project. Let me talk about structuring this book. I struggled to structure this book so much. I rewrote this book like 6 times, and it drove me crazy. I did a book conference in end of 2022, and I called up my advisor afterwards. And I was like, I quit. Like, I am done. I need to find a structure for this. And the debate, here's the problem. And you can sense this when we get to the empirical part of the book. I study American politics technically. Right, I am educated to study Congress and polarization. Those are the classes that I teach. But at my heart, in my soul, I am a public policy scholar. I study agenda setting. I'm a Brian Jones student, a Frank Baumgartner mentee. That's my literature. I like that stuff, and I tried to marry the two for years, marry the two literatures and say, look, there's this great literature on extended political parties. Let's talk about that. There's this great literature on party positioning from people like Christina Wolbrecht. Let's talk about that. And it just didn't work. And eventually I just gave up and I said, you know something, I'm writing a theory of polarization that's policy process. That's trying to predict that the parties will polarize based upon information. The policy process thinks a lot about information and how that flows through a political system. And I'm going to write that theory of polarization. As soon as I figured that out, I had the whole book figured out. That's my second chapter. I call it The Problem with Problem Solving. I'm very proud of it. It's my favorite thing I've ever written. And the argument I make there is essentially the argument we talked about with experts earlier. that when you're a partisan, if you're in the extended political network and you have policy demands, you really don't want your allies working with experts that aren't yours, because those experts might go rogue. They might say, hey, Joe Biden, gas prices are high. You should probably release oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Whereas an environmental group might say, like, I think you should do like electric cars or something. And then, and then if they're successful, maybe 10 years from now, we have lower gas prices, but not now, before the next election. Whereas a real expert doesn't have an agenda. They're just going to say, hey, you want to lower gas prices? Here are your options. And what's great about that is it's a centripetal force in politics. It doesn't polarize parties because they're both getting the same prescriptions. There's still room for disagreement. Political parties should disagree. They should be a little bit polarized. Schachtschneider tells us that that's really bad for democracy when they just agree on everything. But that range is limited, and it's limited because they're all trying to solve the same problem. That's the problem on the agenda, and they all have the same set of options. So one party might choose a different set of trade-offs. They might say, hey, we think these are the people who should bear the cost. We think that, this is the type of government program that we normatively think is appropriate. But that range is narrow. But once you remove that agreement and they can say, no, actually passing this law does the opposite that you think it does, then the range for disagreement becomes great. And it allows entrepreneurial partisans to capture that process, to get in between experts, to kind of short circuit the problem solving process that we see in agenda setting. It's not perfect. So for example, during COVID, the early part of COVID, we saw Democrats and Republicans very quickly agree on many of the policy solutions that they would use. When microchip shortages were making it difficult to manufacture things in the United States, we very quickly saw the parties come together and say, here's what we can do to subsidize American microchip manufacturing. So there's still lots of range for agreement over facts. But what I show in the book, what I argue in that first part of the book, is that that's the key thing that think tanks do, is that they got in between that process. I structured it this way very intentionally. I wanted people to read the book. Most people don't read academic books. I got a lot of books that I haven't read on my bookshelf right now. About to go on parental leave, and I'm gonna read a bunch of them. I think probably not. Let's be honest. But if I got a lot of books that I would love to read, I'll probably skim them. I want people to read this book, and I want people outside of political science to read it. Think tanks are a subject that are of more interest to non-political scientists than political scientists. Something I'm trying to change very quickly. And I think so far I've been very happy. I've been contacted by people who work at think tanks who said, hey, I learned something from this book and I really think it's interesting. Some interesting criticisms, nothing really big. But the funders are actually the thing that the criticism I've heard the most. They're like, you need to talk about who funds these people. Because they're funding the same people that the think tanks are talking to. There's a real network that's bound together there. And I think that's perfectly reasonable and it's perfectly in line with the results. And it's a great book for someone else to write. And I like talking about policy, not about kind of the strict politics of this, but there certainly is more traditional American politics work that these think tanks are involved in. And I look forward to other scholars kind of taking that and running with it.
So I did want to ask you, because we're in the middle of this campaign and, and a lot of times people outside of certain circles don't really hear much about Center for American Politics or AEI.
Yep.
But we're hearing a lot about the Heritage Foundation and this Project 2025, which apparently was being sort of lasered onto Trump Tower last night in Chicago from pictures that I saw as Project 2025 headquarters. And so I'm wondering, how does this particular instance with Project 2025 and the 2024 election and the Trump campaign and the Republican Party, what are we seeing there in terms of what your book is telling us?
In my professional capacity, I hate to take positions on policy, but I love to take positions on good politics. And that was good politics, putting the holographic Project 2025 above Trump here in the great city of Chicago. So good job, activists. I appreciate the craft. So Project 2025, it is, what's fascinating is it is both new in the closeness it has to Donald Trump, and it's exactly the same thing Heritage has done in every election since 1980. What Heritage has done, it has had a two-part program. Part one is release a bunch of policy ideas. They call it the mandate for leadership. I've read every mandate for leadership cover to cover. They are all big. They're all thick. They're all too big. But they're fascinating because they're organized by agency. So each agency gets a chapter, and it says, okay, this is the diagnoses the conservative things that they want to talk about at that agency, the agenda for conservatives, and then comes up with a list of pretty specific policy priorities. That specificity changes depending on who writes the chapter. Some of these are pretty general, pretty broad. Some are very specific. This is a very specific thing you can do. It doesn't say we want to eliminate the Department of Education or just say that. It says here's 10 things you can do if it still exists at the Department of Education to make policy more conservative. And it's been a very effective tool for Heritage because presidents don't do a lot of policy planning during the campaign. Candidates don't do a lot of policy planning. They don't have time for it, nor is it really a good thing. And I think they found out, now that it's become more popular, that writing things down is a liability on the campaign. The Heritage Foundation wrote down 922 pages of things that Donald Trump could do if reelected. There was a very credible connection between the Heritage Foundation and who wrote Project 2025 and the Trump administration, more than it has been for any Republican administration since Ronald Reagan. Heritage in its DNA is an insurgent organization. It was founded in opposition to Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon and Republicans in Congress. It made an alliance with Ronald Reagan, who is himself an insurgent, and so it was very quickly on the inside with Ronald Reagan. But once that relationship went away, you started to see Heritage become an outside organization, at least in executive politics. They were always very close to especially House Republicans for a long time, very, very close to Newt Gingrich, very close to the Republican Revolution that you see beginning in 1995. But not close to the Bush administrations, very much a critic of the Bush administrations, maybe their harshest critic on things like climate change and immigration. They produced hundreds of reports criticizing the Bush administration on those two issues. And even at the beginning of the Trump administration, they were temperamentally aligned with Donald Trump, but Donald Trump was not a conservative when he ran in 2016. He was an insurgent, and so they co-opt that. There's not a lot of if Donald Trump's going to hire a lot of people after 2016 and 2017, he's going to hire a mix of people from the Republican Party, which he did, but they're going to favor the insurgent side of the party. So Heritage has this kind of renewed influence during that time. They had recently, in the last 5 years, really tacked very hard to the right, beginning in the mid-2010s. Their longtime president, Ed Feulner, retires, and they hired Jim DeMint, a former senator from North Carolina, who, and this tells you about influence, retires from the Senate early in order to be president of the Heritage Foundation, right? Very, very important moment in that part of American politics. Fires a lot of the old guard at Heritage, people like Stuart Butler, or forces them out. I'm not sure if he was technically fired. And then takes this hard right tack. So they're ready to kind of co-opt Trump and really takes Trump, who ran as, I'm not going to say a moderate, but I'd say an iconoclast, real different on a lot of issues, and kind of turns his administration to this hard right administration. Trump then loses the 2020 election. He's out of power, and their strategy is basically create the new Trump administration in waiting, allow Donald Trump, who has his own reasons to not want traditional kind of normal Republicans in his administration, to staff the federal government with real hard right conservative loyalists rather than people who are going to say no to him. So Trump has this kind of very Trumpy attitude, and the Heritage Foundation just wants really hard conservatives in government, and wants to kind of undermine some of the processes that have been making it harder for conservatives to get things done. And so Project 2025 is both bigger and more detailed than the last few editions of this, and it was accompanied by a much more aggressive personnel staffing part. The Heritage Foundation was always involved in staffing Republican administrations. Depending on who you talk to, they put a few dozen people in the Reagan administration, or hundreds. Heritage says hundreds. They become they create this very, very close organization to Donald Trump, staffed by former senior Trump administration officials. And then when it becomes unpopular, because they wrote it all down like they have in every year since 1980, and anybody can go online and see the policy promises that the platformless Donald Trump campaign is probably going to enact if elected to office, that stuff becomes toxic. Because this kind of hard right stuff is toxic, as is a lot of hard left stuff, right? If you gave Democrats truth serum of what they would want in a vacuum where they didn't have to care about politics, it'd probably be pretty unpopular stuff. As is banning abortion and doing all sorts of stuff that conservatives would want if given truth serum. But because it was written all down and credibly connected to Donald Trump, you have this enormous backlash. And I am fascinated if Donald Trump loses to see how that runs back on the Trump administration, on Heritage. Are they blamed for the loss? Is the lesson that they take, don't write it down, which they might? Is the lesson that they take, maybe, this is not a popular policy agenda, a winning policy agenda? I don't know. Does Heritage exist or exist in its, in its level of influence after that happens? I'm really curious to see what happens. I mean, if Donald Trump wins, is Donald Trump going to go back on his promises to distance himself from the Heritage Foundation? Is he going to say, I don't like you guys anymore, go away? I'm not sure. It'll be fascinating either way.
And so what you're talking about here, and again, we don't know what will necessarily happen next, is that there is this plan that has been connected now to the Trump campaign, and we will see, what happens if Trump is elected or not. And while Kamala Harris is part of the Biden administration, does she have a similar plan that has been written for her by a think tank?
Not yet. So the Center for American Progress did write a mandate for leadership, a very much mirror of mandate for leadership in 2008. I'm not aware of one. I don't think they wrote one in 2016, and I'm not aware of one right now. That said, they certainly will be involved in a new administration. They were involved in the Biden administration, though interestingly, Joe Biden, unlike Barack Obama, unlike the Hillary Clinton transition that would have occurred, did not have senior Center for American Progress people on that transition. That said, he hired Neera Tanden, the president of the Center for American Progress, first to be OMB director. Her confirmation failed, and then she has had since then senior non-confirmable White House positions. And so she was very influential there. But, I think it's interesting that Joe Biden kind of said, no, I don't want these people involved. Now, I will say some of his senior advisors have close connections to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Jared Bernstein's the chair of the Council on Economic Advisors, was a senior economist at the center for a very long time. So there certainly was influence there. And I just don't think we at this point know enough about kind of where Harris is going to position herself within the party. There also are farther left think tanks that she could draw from. There's farther centrist think tanks that she could draw from. We're not sure at this point. It's also the first transition in a while of a sitting vice president.
Right.
And so we don't really know how that's going to go. So I'll be fascinated to watch. And your podcast guest, Heath Brown's the guy to ask about it.
And I asked him a lot of those questions last week, as you know. So you've implied a little bit of what you're working on next, which continues the stream of research with regard to think tanks. But what are you doing that is going to be different in the next project?
So in the next project, we're studying every think tank. So we have a sample of 250 think tanks that we got from a database called Overton. And we have 500,000 reports from those think tanks. This is a co-authored with Alexander Furness at Northwestern University. And what we want to ask is we want to ask the effect of funding, the priorities of funders on the policy agenda of think tanks. So we've coded those think tanks using some machine learning for their agendas. We know what, of those 500,000 reports, we know what issues they're on. And we have some data on donations to think tanks through foundations. Now, think tanks are 501c3 organizations. They do not have to declare their donors. Those are not public record. But foundations have to declare who they give money to. And so we do have a portion of their donations. It's not as large of a portion as we were hoping for. So it's about 20 to 30% of their overall budget. And so we're working on other ways to measure think tanks, think tank or donor priorities. But we can actually identify the priorities of a lot of these foundations. In part, some of them are associated with lobbying entities. So they are the foundations of a corporation. They have policy priorities. We can measure that. Some of them list their policy priorities on their website. We can measure that. And we want to see if the overall ecosystem of think tanks, of the policy ideas produced by our system, is biased by the priorities of donors. Preliminarily, we think it looks like we're going to find that. So, for example, you think about progressive issues, you can kind of put them in two camps: non-materialist issues and materialist issues, redistribution of wealth, and then stuff like environmental policy, energy policy, education policy. And what you see is a bias toward those types of issues in the Democratic Party. Why? Because rich people don't really care that much about redistributing wealth, or often don't, right? They would be the targets of the redistribution of wealth. But some of them care a lot about climate change. They care a lot of other issues. And so that's what they want to give money to focus on. If you're a Democrat, if you're a progressive, that's a problem, right? It's a problem because you may want your party to focus on redistributive issues, but you have this massive legislative subsidy for these other things, this policy subsidy for these other things. So we're still engaging in that. We're going to see we have lots of think tanks, left, right, center, single issue think tanks which are government contractors. There's a lot of really fun organizations in there, and we're going to be able to map the whole system. It's moving along. I think we'll start to produce products toward the middle of next year from all these data, but it's going to be fascinating. And I think really, I think you're going to see a difference between these partisan type think tanks, not just the four I looked at, but others that are similar and smaller, and the neutral think tanks, the think tanks that are more like universities or are aggressively bipartisan. And I'm curious to see the results.
Well, I hope when it becomes a book, you and your co-author will come on the New Books
I
Network
will.
and talk
We
to
will.
me about it. Excellent. I want to thank E.J. Fagan for joining me today to talk about The Thinkers, the rise of partisan think tanks and the polarization of American politics, published by Oxford University Press. Do you have a brick and mortar store with an online presence to which you would like to give a shout out?
I don't think brick and mortar stores have my book anywhere. So no, I don't. Honestly, buy it from Oxford University Press. Go straight to the source. They're the ones who shelve the cost of producing this, and I want them to let me write another one. So let's sell some books.
All right. Thank you, EJ. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Lily.